Boop. Happy Tuesday. Today is Tuesday, June the 8th, 2021, and today's daily Bible readings come to us from Psalm 108, 1 Samuel 8, 1 through 22, Revelation 27 through 15, or you could also have read Psalm 74, 1 Kings 18, 17 through 40, and then end up with Revelation 27 through 15. I'm going to look at 1 Samuel 8, 1 through 22, and talk about when good judges' kids go bad, right? So if you don't know the story of 1 Samuel, it begins with the birth of Samuel, who was the last judge of Israel, so to speak. Well, not exactly the last judge, but he was the last good judge. And you'll understand that more as we get into it. If you've already read the text for today, you already know what I'm talking about. But Samuel let's talk about Samuel and Eli first. So God had called up Samuel to be judge over Israel during the time of Eli, the priest. And there's this whole story about how like Eli, kind of talked to Samuel's mother and kind of thought she was drunk and everything and all that stuff. Go back and read 1 Samuel. But God had called Samuel into this position of being judge over Israel at a very young age. He was serving sort of as, I guess you could say, an apprentice or maybe an intern, unpaid intern, I don't know, for Eli, who was the priest over Israel. And if you go back and you read that story, the first thing that God had Samuel do as a child, which is kind of, dang, that's like a lot to put on a kid. But his first order of business was to pronounce judgment over Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, not like as in Phineas and Ferb, but Hophni and Phinehas for the way that they had abused their position, abused their privilege as priests, as leaders among the people of Israel, because what they were doing, they were abusing their position and consequently abusing the people who they were supposed to be watching out for, who they were supposed to be taking care of. You remember earlier in the DBRs this spring, we talked about how, the priest, like the Aaron, the chief priest, and then the Levites were put in a position to stand in between the people and God. They weren't above the people. They were alongside the people to try to lift them up and to be there on their behalf, right? Well, these priests were abusing that. They were, and I'm not going to go into the details of what they were doing, but you can go back and read that. But they took advantage of the people for their own benefit, right? With no consideration or concern for others or what others were going through or what their needs were. They just looked at the flock as people to be fleeced, and they took advantage of it for their own good. And God wasn't happy about that. And so the message, the judgment that God had Samuel, this now judge over Israel, pronounce was that he was going to cut off Eli's household. Well, fast forward, now Samuel himself is older. He has 2 sons, and guess what? They're following along just like Eli's sons did in the family business. Now they're leaders over the people of Israel. They're not priests necessarily, as much as they're judges, just like their dad. So Samuel wasn't technically the last judge of Israel, but Joel and Abijah, his sons, were. And so now Samuel's own sons are judges over Israel, and they commit the same kind of crimes as Hophni and Phinehas in a little bit different way. But it says that they turned aside after gain, they took bribes, and perverted justice. So in other words, their whole job is that they're supposed to be these impartial judges over Israel. They're supposed to determine what's right and what's wrong, who's right, who's wrong, to make sure justice is meted out between parties and make sure that everybody gets their due. But they turned aside from that, and they took advantage of the situation to get stuff for themselves. So like it says, if you had money, you could buy justice. You could buy justice for yourself. You could make sure things got done for you and not for the person who actually really was on the short side, the person that maybe you actually owed something to because you had been unjust to them. The job of the judge of Israel was to make sure that didn't happen, and they were perverting that, as it says. So, people would come up, slip them a $20 under the counter, so to speak, and lo and behold, guess what? They're walking out of court. So they turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. And you're like, but they're pastors, right? They're leaders, they're priests, they're judges. Well, power messes with people. People fall prey to temptation just in general. And not only is it an occupational hazard of having authority, whether you be, a priest or a judge or a pastor or, a leader of any sort, that's a potential occupational hazard of having that kind of authority. It's an occupational hazard of being human. We humans are attracted to wealth and power in a bad way, and it tends to lead us down paths we ought not to go. It makes us turn aside after gain for ourselves at the cost of other people. The interesting thing about this story is that the people of Israel, they've seen this happen before, right? The whole reason God acted and pronounced judgment against Eli's sons is that the people of Israel were crying out against them, right? He heard their cries. And so they've been there before. They've seen it. There's probably people who remember that time, and even though they know Samuel, but they also knew Eli, and they knew what was going on then, and so they're just done with it. And they're like, we don't need judges anymore. You know what would fix this? We can't trust the priests. We can't trust the judges. We need a king, because nobody has more power and authority than a king. And so they decide that they thought that a king would be better. God, Samuel gets his nose bent out of joint about this. We've talked about that before. Samuel thinks it's all about him, and God's like, they're not. It's not about you. Don't get all hurt about this. They're rejecting me just like they've rejected me ever since I brought them out of Egypt, and that's really the case. The person who they need to trust is God. He's the one that can't be bribed. He's the one that doesn't really need anything from us, and so he's the one who can decide justly. But the people wanted a king. They wanted to put their faith in the frailty of yet another powerful person, another human being who would fall prey to this occupational hazard of power and wealth and self. It's a good word for it. It's misplaced faith that we have, which is another occupational hazard of being human, I guess, is that we tend to place our faith in ourselves or other people who are just as frail as us rather than placing our faith in God. Anyway, that's the DBR for today. Go out, enjoy the day. We'll be back tomorrow. See you later. Boop.